This is our third and final exercise devoted to the Preferences dialog box. If you don't have Preferences open on screen, then press Control-K, Command-K on the Mac. I'm going to switch to the next panel. So here I am in Plugins and Scratch Disks. I can click on Next, or I can go ahead and choose from this pop-up menu, User Interface. Now note that we have a couple of interesting checkboxes here. One is Auto Collapse Icon Panels. So in other words, anytime you bring up one of these panels by clicking on an icon, and that, for example, might bring up the Navigator panel. We saw that demonstrated in a previous exercise. Why then, as soon as you move your cursor away from it, if you turn on this checkbox, the panel will automatically collapse and free up that screen real estate. If you don't want that to happen, which I don't find that to be particularly useful, then leave this checkbox turned off. Next is Open Documents as Tabs. That opens all documents consolidated into a single tabbed window interface. And we saw how that works in a previous exercise as well. If you'd prefer to work with floating windows, then turn this checkbox off. And from now on, whenever you open an illustration, it will appear in a floating window. I don't happen to like working that way here on the PC, so I go ahead and leave this checkbox turned on. On the Mac, it varies. Anyway, we also have this brightness option, which allows you to make the interface brighter if it's too dark for you, so you'll have more contrast. However, if you feel like the interface is competing for attention with the illustration itself, then you can dim down the brightness like so. But the problem is, if you go ultra dark with the brightness, notice that the text doesn't invert, which it really should. If it's going to go this dark, we ought to be able to see the word style, for example, as white against its dark background. I think this makes for too little contrast, except for in weird areas, like these little highlights don't dim down. So I don't really like this slider bar all that much. That is to say, I either set it to the middle option, like so, or I leave it set to its default, which is one tick mark over from light. Completely up to you what you decide to do. I just want you to know it's there. And then finally, I'm going to skip down to Appearance of Black. Now, this is a real techie option. However, it makes a big difference when you're working inside of Illustrator. The idea is this. Let's say you're going to pre-press, meaning that you or someone else is going to ultimately submit your illustration for commercial output. And you go ahead and specify a color as 100% black, that is 100% K, without any cyan, magenta, or yellow ink whatsoever. That means you might have some trapping problems where you have little white edges all over the place. I'll explain what I mean by that in greater detail in a later chapter. It also means that your blacks might end up looking a little faded, so they'll look dark gray instead of really ultra rich black. A rich black has not only lots of black ink in it, but some cyan, magenta, and yellow ink as well. So the question becomes, what do you want to see on screen? Do you want to display all blacks as rich black? That's an absolutely crazy thing to do. I still, to this day, do not understand why Adobe does that by default. You want to display your blacks accurately, because that way you can predict the trapping problems, and you can also see where your blacks are going to look a little weak, and you need to add additional ink. And over time, you'll be able to pick them out very easily. And that means your commercially reproduced documents are going to look that much better. However, it also means that you'll assign black to a color, and then it'll look a little gray, and that troubles a lot of users. And so I gather that's why Adobe goes with the other setting. But this is the much better setting right there. Printing and exporting output all blacks as rich black, I agree with, because the idea here is if you're going to print your document locally to an inkjet printer, for example, or you're going to export your document to a PDF file, why then in that case, it makes sense to go ahead and output all your blacks as rich blacks, because that's just the more convenient solution. You're not going to pre-press. The only time you'd want to change this is if you find yourself using PDF documents and inkjet output for proofing purposes and you're trying to get a sense of how your artwork really is going to print, why then in that case you want to output all your blacks accurately. That's not the way I work, however. I'm either creating a document for commercial reproduction or I'm printing or exporting it locally. And so I stick with the default option for this second setting. But definitely, in my opinion, if you're following my advice, display all blacks accurately and then we're done. Click OK in order to accept your modification to those preferences.